Colby Covington just released a weird promo. Colby Covington just released a weird promo video calling out Ian Garry, and I understand why Colby has pivoted over to this direction rather than taking on something like Wonderboy Thompson, which I don't see any of us really being challenging for Colby. We all know Colby is someone who should be rushing takedowns. Not that he did a lot against Leon Edwards, but he is someone who should be rushing takedowns. And Stephen Wonderboy Thompson isn't one of those guys that has phenomenal takedown defense. Pretty good, but not phenomenal takedown defense. It just seems like a bit of a gimme fight for Colby Covington. Didn't get a lot of respect put on it. So Colby has now pivoted and called out Ian Garry in a pretty Colby Covington-esque way. And honestly, that fight is fine, but I think if we, the Ian Garry haters out there, really want to get behind someone who can actually stop Ian Garry and finish them, I do believe that the UFC just had them introduced to the division, and that is MVP. MVP might be our best shot at finally stopping this Ian Garry cringe train. So I think all of the people out there that love to hate Ian Garry should be getting on the MVP hype train. Now, why do I think this? I mean, let's just break down their last fight, right? Like, Ian Garry just took on Jeff Neal. Now, Jeff Neal was doing pretty well in that fight. Ian Garry is meant to be this amazing striker that nobody can touch, but I think the conversation that we all left with and what we all saw after Ian Garry versus Jeff Neal was that if Jeff Neal had actually just pushed forward a little bit more, he could have won that fight. I mean, Jeff Neal was having some fairly decent success on the feet with Garry once he started to close him into the corner of the cage. Garry needs someone who is going to give him a lot of space and let him style on them. That's very much Ian Garry's way of fighting. And you might be thinking like, well, wouldn't MVP be like that? But MVP is a great counter striker and he comes up with a lot of unorthodox strikes. Ian Garry does very well against people who will just stand in front of him and not be that elusive. So I do think when you start to look at MVP, having to control the range a little bit better than Ian Garry, it does make for a much more exciting fight. And considering that Ian Garry doesn't want to lose, MVP doesn't want to lose, he doesn't have the chance to put together a couple of losses and then build himself back up to the title. If MVP wants to win a UFC title, he needs to be winning every single fight he can while he's here. He is not the youngest man on the roster. So if you take someone who has decent striking, and I think we can all agree that MVP is a more than decent striker, and I say decent striking because Jeff Neal has very decent striking, and you can do well against Ian Garry as long as you bring the fight to him. Again, he is someone who likes to counter strike and play back. MVP can bring the fight to him. A lot of elusive leg kicks, a lot of elusive spinning elbows, just a lot of elusive movement in general. If he can bring that to Ian Garry, I think we're going to have a much more exciting fight than, say, Ian Garry versus Wonderboy, who might look to just dance around outside of each other and actually have two people going forward and rushing in for some type of finish. I mean, even in the Ian Garry versus Neil Magny fight, Ian Garry looked great as Neil Magny's legs started to go out from under him. And then once he did, Ian Garry just sort of stood around and leg kicked at Neil Magny while he was on the ground. He didn't finish Neil Magny. Ian Garry is not a finisher. And I think for MVP, he might be one of those fighters that sort of matches the level of competition that's in there with him and always raises the bar just enough to win it, right? It's very similar to how Israel Adesanya would defend a title. He never did more than he needed to do to win a fight. And Ian Garry, who is just in there to, it feels like just point score. I mean, why didn't he finish Neil Magny? You know, why didn't he push back against Jeff Neal? If Ian Garry is bouncing around the outside and popping shots, MVP can play that game all day long and probably then some. Because again, what we were missing from Jeff Neal was a little bit of push forward and bring it. And I do believe MVP can push forward and bring it. And he is not a one-dimensional striker like Ian Garry's previous opponents. Then, of course, there is everything leading up and going into the fight, right? Ian Garry came out last time in front of the fans as a little bit more quiet, a little bit more subdued, because obviously the fan momentum is just going against him massively. But when Ian Garry is feeling himself and his wife has given him some half-decent lines to say at the press conference, he will generally go against his fighter. I mean, look how horribly he treated Neil Magny at the press conference. Ian Garry thinks he's the next Conor McGregor. Nowhere near, not even close, but he thinks he's the next Conor McGregor, and he likes to do a lot of talking on the microphone. Well, MVP has been in this game forever and a day. Obviously not here at the UFC, at a UFC press conference, but he has still been in the MMA fighting world forever and a day. He had to put up with Mike Perry, for God's sake. Like, the dude knows how to trash talk back. And with MVP's experience in the game and Ian Garry's like half-written lines, I think not only can MVP match Ian Garry in the cage, maybe even dominate him and beat him in the cage, but I think when they get to the press conference, what Ian Garry is going to try and do on the press conference, try and bully MVP around, isn't going to last. Like, not even for a minute, not even for a second. I think Ian Garry and MVP can actually have a damn good press conference, and MVP can steamroll Ian Garry, absolutely steamroll him at the press conference, make him feel like a kid up there. And Ian Garry is still a kid in the game. Ian Garry might like it a little bit, you know, MVP daddying him, Ian Garry reading Mummy's lines and having a go at them. Like, Ian Garry will find himself somewhere in the middle just watching Mummy's lines play off Daddy's bounce backs, and I think that's the sort of thing that Ian Garry would enjoy. And then, of course, once the press conference is done and MVP just schools Ian Garry, you know, the fight is actually happening, neither of them want to lose. Neither of them want to have a loss on their record right now at this stage of the game. That makes it a really fun fight for us, the fans. You know what I mean? Like, Ian Garry's style is that stand-up, rangy kickboxing style. MVP's style is MVP's style. I mean, it feels like that karate base Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, but it is just very MVP-esque. And that actually leads to a really fun fight for us, the fans. You know, Michael Venom Page, he talked about how he didn't want the Stephen Thompson fight because it might be a little bit too counter-strikery, and that can turn into a bit of a boring fight. And he's not wrong. When both people are sort of looking to play with each other and not really engage, that can turn into a bit of a boring style of fight. But both of these guys, Michael and Ian, are going to want to engage with each other, and they're going to do it in a really creative fashion, especially from Michael Venom Page's side. That makes it an incredibly fun fight for us, the fans, to watch. Plus, then there is all of this like new blood in the UFC, old school MMA heads sort of bodying and teaching the young Ian Garry that we all love to hate. I mean, the only time that his interviews get any press at all is when people are hate watching him, unfortunately for the kid. Like, he thinks everyone's there to watch him perform. And, you know, he said so many fans flew out to see him perform. I don't think that's the case at all. I don't think he has a very strong fan base at all. When you look at his interview numbers that go against people hating him or just have not really got any spice on them to watch, they're just regular, normal, everyday athlete interviewer interviews, they don't tend to get a lot of numbers, not more than anybody else. Ian Garry is a very middle-of-the-road sort of popularity fighter. He's there for us, the fans, to pretty much hate on after just all the embarrassing stuff that he has been through, and his wife and the WAG book. But I do think when you put him in the cage against a fun dance partner, that's when you do get to see something great, and we are going to be entertained by that. Out of all the people that could be hitching their wagon to the next Ian Garry fight, Colby Covington, I'm not really interested in that. Colby Covington's career is sort of over. Stephen Wonderboy Thompson could be fun. Both great fighters, both great stand-up styles. But to me, MVP is the one that we should be hitching our wagon to, and I think he can beat him. I think he can find him with a counter shot. I think he can frustrate Ian Garry in the cage. I think Ian Garry can try and put together some longer combinations to actually try and get that reach across and touch Michael Venom Page. And it's when Ian Garry is rushing forward with that chin up that he does do, Michael Venom Page can do some of his wild spinning counterattacks and actually land on the chin with Ian Garry, get him down onto the cage, and maybe jump on a rear naked choke and actually end up finishing him, embarrassing him at the press conference, embarrassing him at the cage, jumping the fence, finding Layla, giving her a kiss on the lips, Ian Garry waking up from the rear naked choke and just clapping away, being like, "Well done, Dad, you got me." Ian Garry, Michael Venom Page, who do you see winning that fight? Put it down there in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And of course, I will see you all in the next one.